Pete Rose won 3 World Series, 3 batting titles, made 17 All-Star games, and has the most hits in baseball history, but he is still not in the Hall of Fame. He's been accused of cheating in order to break the hit record, trying to sell drugs while in the major leagues, having a relationship with a minor, ending a player's career after running him over in an All-Star game, selling fake autographs, assaulting an umpire, betting on his own team to lose, and in 1990, he was sentenced to prison. But despite all of these allegations and being chased off the field by angry fans multiple times, Pete Rose is not only justifiably an American icon, he is one of the most beloved players ever. At one point, he was the self-proclaimed most famous white athlete in the world, is in the WWE Hall of Fame, was a reality TV star, was a manager and a player at the same time, signed the biggest contract in team sports history, and played harder than any other player in baseball. But why did Pete Rose go to prison? Are the allegations of cheating in baseball and betting against his own team true? And why a friendship gone wrong in 1989 led to him being permanently banned from baseball? Despite popular belief, Pete Rose is actually in the Hall of Fame. In 1998, he was tombstone pile-drived by his arch nemesis, Kane. The next year, after disguising himself as the San Diego Chicken, Kane pile-drived him again. And in 2000, Kane chokeslammed him, which was followed by a stink face.
Don't open your eyes! Somebody help poor Pete!
Pete Rose was 59 years old, which was good enough to earn himself a spot in the WWE Hall of Fame. But this was only one of many weird yet entertaining ways Pete Rose was able to make a living. In 2013, he had his own TLC reality show centered around him and his fiancée, who is a Playboy model and 39 years younger than Pete Rose. The show is mostly about Rose trying to get into the Hall of Fame and his wife's breast reduction surgery, which he was not a big fan of.
Too small.
Pete Rose even sells the opportunity to have dinner with him. He lets you bring 4 guests, promises to take 4 pictures, and signs 4 baseballs, and it only costs $5,000. However, guests are expected to pay for dinner. And perhaps his weirdest job was when he was hired by Fox to cover MLB. Because unlike his colleagues, Pete Rose was banned from being on the field or going into the clubhouse, but still broadcasted from outside the stadium, until 2017 when Fox fired him after what is probably the worst allegation ever made against Pete Rose, which is saying a lot because he's been accused of almost everything. A lot of them are true, but a lot of them are not. But before I get to that, thank you to Lightning Link Casino for sponsoring today's video, the app that brings virtual casino games to your phone for free. All you have to do is click the link below or scan this QR code. It is not real gambling, you must be 18 years or older, success in social gaming does not imply future success in gambling, and there are no cash prizes. Lightning Link offers dozens of different games, including my favorite, the Western style Wild Chuco, where you can feel like a cowboy and win a ton of coins while doing it. Lightning Link Casino offers new missions every day that always make the game interesting. One spin can be the difference of losing or earning a hold and spin and winning 27 million coins, which I did yesterday. No big deal, I'm pretty good at the game. And since it's Thanksgiving, they are celebrating with popular virtual slot machines like Dragon Link and Buffalo Gold, plus doing a full week of exciting events, offers, and in-game gifts. So if you want to be a winner, like me, click the link in the description or scan this QR code to download in the iOS or Google Play Store and get a free 10 million coins to get you started. So if you want to support the channel, please click the link below. Pete Rose is one of the best players in history, but if it wasn't for a huge lie and an extreme case of nepotism, he would have never played a single game of Major League Baseball. According to his coach in high school, Pete Rose was only the 3rd best player on his team, but was obsessed with making the major leagues. He claims he doesn't remember reading a single book in his life besides the Major League Rule Book. His dad wouldn't let him go to the movie theaters because he thought it would damage his eyes and make him worse at baseball. And in high school, he was left back a grade because instead of going to summer school, his dad had him play summer baseball, which he thought was more important, which actually worked out perfectly. During his 5th year of high school, he wasn't eligible to play because it would have been his 5th season. Instead, he joined a local adult league, hoping a scout would see him. But Pete Rose was under 6 feet and 155 pounds. But a scout from Cincinnati did see him and wrote a report that said, quote, "He can't hit, throw, or field. All he can do is hustle." Fortunately for Pete Rose, his uncle was also a scout for the Reds. One day, he busted into the Reds general manager's office, promising that his nephew would grow, hustle no matter what, and sign for basically nothing. After graduating high school, he did sign for basically nothing, and according to Sports Illustrated, Rose even admitted to reporter Al Michaels that he lied about his age in order to get a signing bonus. Rose signed to the Reds for $7,000 with a $5,000 bonus if he ever made it to the major leagues, and in the next 3 seasons, he gained 50 pounds, and despite making 36 errors in his first minor league season, he dominated at the plate and made the Reds roster in 1963, where many of his teammates immediately hated him. As a rookie, he still lived with his parents in his childhood home right outside of Cincinnati and shared a room with his 15-year-old brother. Kids in his neighborhood literally gave him a push out of his driveway on the way to games because his car had a hard time starting. But when he did get to games, he stood out. When he got walked, he sprinted to first base, sprinted on and off the field, backed up every play no matter how unnecessary it was, spiked the ball into the ground after every inning, loved running over fielders when he got the chance, and according to some, was the first player to do a headfirst slide. After trying to catch a ball that went 60 feet over the fence, Whitey Ford gave him the nickname Charlie Hustle just to make fun of him. Pete Rose loved the name and has branded himself with it ever since. Pete Rose is respected for giving as much effort as any player in the history of baseball, but many of his teammates still resented him, mainly for taking the Reds' former second baseman's position. The team's veterans would barely talk to Rose in his rookie season, so instead he gravitated toward players like Frank Robinson, Vada Pinson, and Tommy Harper, the team's 3 black players. Rose says he was scolded by teammates for sharing a hotel room with a black player and for tying Frank Robinson's cleats one day just as a joke. But Pete Rose didn't care because to him, they were the only teammates that treated him fairly. But soon, Pete Rose earned the respect of pretty much everyone because he went from not being able to, quote, hit, field, or throw to winning Rookie of the Year that season. He also got married that season and left the reception of his own wedding early just to go to a ceremony put on by Cincinnati's baseball writers. This was the first of many stories that made Pete Rose's legend off the field as big as his legend on the field. Around this time, he supposedly had a picture over his fireplace with his head on the body of a naked baby. He also had a different woman in every National League city and would soon be the center of multiple investigations by MLB, the IRS, and the FBI. In 1979, a woman went to court with Pete Rose saying that he was the father of her child and he had to settle out of court. He supposedly had 2 sets of tickets to home games, one for his family and one for his girlfriends. His first wife says she confronted one of these women and ripped the necklace off of her during a game because it belonged to their daughter. Pete Rose was simultaneously becoming a baseball legend. Starting in 1965, he made the All-Star team 16 times in 18 years, playing 5 different positions. He finished with a batting average over 300 15 of those years and led the league in hits in 7 of them. He was the face of Aqua Velva, was in commercials for Milk Duds, Ballpark Franks, Wheaties, Atari, Kool-Aid, and more. He had his own energy bar, own chocolate drink, ashtrays, mugs, and statues. He was even featured in Playboy magazine, where he famously admitted to taking amphetamines before games, something that pretty much every major leaguer did, but he was probably the only one to admit it. Rose was also becoming famous for his long list of notorious altercations and fights with players and umpires. In 1970, Pete Rose is credited for ruining Ray Fosse's career in a game that didn't even count. Pete Rose was the winning run, so instead of trying to slide around Fosse, he ran him over with full force, even though it was an all-star game. Pete Rose said that he had no choice but to run him over because his dad was in the front row, and if he saw him play like a sissy, he would beat his ass. Ray Fosse played in the next game after x-rays showed no damage, but struggled the rest of the year. That offseason, doctors discovered his shoulder was actually separated and fractured. His shoulder never healed properly, and although he did make the All-Star team the next year, he dealt with severe pain his entire life, and after 1971, never made it back to the All-Star game. By the time he retired, he couldn't even raise his elbow over his shoulder. Following the incident, Ray Fosse seemed like he didn't blame Pete Rose for playing hard, but according to Pete Rose, since then, Fosse has refused to be at the same autograph signing as him and believes Rose tried to hurt him on purpose. Pete Rose was also in the center of one of the most famous brawls of all time. In the 1973 NLCS, Reds player Joe Morgan told Mets player Bud Harrelson he was going to punch him in the face because Harrelson had told the media the Reds hitters were bad the day before. The two had to be separated. So during the game, when Rose slid into Harrelson's knee and allegedly elbowed him, Harrelson decided to fight him. The two rolled on the ground, the benches cleared, more fights occurred, and the next inning, Rose went into left field and was immediately pelted with batteries, trash, beer cans, and when a whiskey bottle came within inches of his head, he was escorted off the field. The whole stadium immediately started throwing trash on the field until Willie Mays, Rusty Staub, Tom Seaver, and Yogi Berra told them if they didn't stop, they were going to have to forfeit. Pete Rose says that he was also escorted off the field in LA and in Chicago after a fan threw a crutch at him and was once hit by a paperclip in the outfield, which led him to bleed for 3 innings. He also assaulted an umpire in 1988 after Dave Pallone correctly called a runner safe, but took too long to do it, allowing the Mets to score a run. Pete Rose says that Pallone poked him in the eye, which made him retaliate. Fans proceeded to throw trash on the field for 15 minutes until the game continued with only 3 umpires because it was too dangerous for Pallone to return to the field. To this day, he says he did not touch Pete Rose and claims Pete Rose admitted to taking nail clippers to his eye after the game to make it look like he got poked, adding that the only reason Pete Rose was upset was because he was betting on the game. Rose was suspended 30 games, the longest manager suspension for an in-game incident of all time. Pete Rose was also the very first victim of Morgana, the kissing bandit, in 1969 after she ran onto the field, kissed him on the cheek, and according to her, went back to her seat with 0 punishment. Pete Rose famously met her and gave her roses the next night in a strip club where she was performing. She would go on to kiss 37 other baseball players during games, getting arrested 19 times for doing it. Moments like these raised his status from just a famous baseball player to an American icon. He had the world in the palm of his hands, which led him to do some strange things that may have turned out to be illegal. In 1977, Rose met a 19-year-old baseball player named Tommy Giosa. Giosa was randomly teaching Pete Rose's son about baseball at a hotel they were both staying at, not knowing who it was. When the kid introduced him to his dad, Pete Rose, he was shocked because Pete Rose was his idol. Weirdly enough, Pete Rose would invite Giosa to live at his house that offseason and kind of morphed him into a Pete Rose clone. The two would live together for several years. He talked like Pete, adopted the same haircut, same batting stance, became a switch hitter like Pete, and was even given a tryout and signed to the Orioles, which was organized by Pete Rose. Giosa would pick up Pete's girlfriends from the airport, send money for him, do chores around the house for him, and basically anything he asked. This seems like a strange, but overall legal relationship. But you should remember Tom Giosa, because this relationship would go on to not only derail Pete Rose's entire life, but also lead Giosa to go to prison. In the meantime, Pete Rose kept winning and breaking records. He won back-to-back World Series in 1975 and 76. In 1978, he was the 13th player to reach 3,000 hits. He was 37 years old and hit over 1,000 more. That same season, he set an NL record by going on a 44-game hit streak and did it with 0 home runs. In 1979, he entered free agency after the Reds were so against paying him $400,000 a year, they bought ads in the paper to make him look greedy. Cincinnati fans literally started a charity fund to try to pay for his contract, but instead he signed what was at the time the largest contract in team sports history. The Braves offered him a $1 million contract plus a bonus of $100,000 every year for the rest of his life. The Pirates offered him racehorses. A team in Japan even offered him more money than the Reds. Instead, he signed to the Phillies on a 4-year, $3.2 million contract because he thought it was his best chance to win a World Series, which he did in 1980. He broke the National League all-time hit record in 1981. The Phillies set off fireworks, but then the hit was immediately changed to an error. He would break the record later that game and even got a call from the president afterwards.
This is Ronald Reagan.
How you doing?
Well,
He then went to Montreal for half a season, then was traded back to the Reds, where he would have one last great moment before his career was derailed forever. The Reds didn't really want a 43-year-old first baseman, but they did need a manager, so in the middle of the season, Pete Rose transitioned from an everyday first baseman in Montreal to a full-time manager and player in Cincinnati. He is more than likely the last player-manager in the history of baseball, and although the plan was for him to mainly manage and pinch hit from time to time, Pete Rose promoted himself to be the primary first baseman in 1985, and at 45 years old, he even made an all-star team. That year in September, he was one hit away from breaking the all-time hit record. He reportedly put on multiple undershirts and said, quote, "I'm going to sell all of these motherfuckers." He then proceeded to get his 4,192nd career hit. He was given a 9-minute standing ovation. A Corvette was driven onto the field and gifted to him, and the broadcast did a toast with 2 cans of Budweiser.
this Bud's for Pete Rose.
However, it was later discovered that 2 of Ty Cobb's hits had actually been counted twice, and Pete Rose actually broke the record 3 days earlier. He played one more year for the Reds, retired as a player, and became the team's full-time manager. And this is where Pete Rose's life got interesting. In 1988, Tommy Giosa, the kid Pete Rose brought into his home years earlier, was investigated for transporting cocaine across state lines, placing bets for Pete Rose, and hiding Pete Rose's winnings from the IRS. For now, Giosa refused to cooperate in an investigation against Rose, but police were investigating another one of Rose's associates for similar crimes and found betting slips in his car that were supposedly Rose's. Sports Illustrated published a story with evidence that Pete Rose had been illegally betting on baseball games that he was managing. MLB found more evidence that showed Pete Rose was more than a degenerate gambler. It was reported that Rose allegedly bet $8,000 to $16,000 a day on baseball games while he was managing the Reds. It was said he had a friend sit in the stands and give him hand signals to tell him if his other bets were winning or losing while he managed games. The New York Post reported that Cincinnati police estimated he was up to $750,000 in debt to illegal bookmakers. And Pete Rose himself said that one bookmaker threatened to burn his house down and break his kids' legs if he didn't pay. John Dowd, the head investigator, has since said he believes that Pete Rose probably bet the Reds to lose. However, this was not in his report, and nobody else connected to Rose has ever claimed he bet his team to lose. But Pete Rose did bet on his team to win, and did it pretty much every single night. At the time, Rose completely denied the allegations and continued to manage for over a year, while MLB, the FBI, and the IRS all investigated him until 1989, when Rose voluntarily signed a document that banned him from baseball, while still claiming he never gambled on baseball. He was still eligible for the Hall of Fame, and Rose seemed confident that Commissioner Giamatti would be open to reversing the suspension after a year if he cleaned up his act, and Giamatti himself said when Pete Rose is eligible for the Hall of Fame, he will be on the ballot. Unfortunately, in an insane twist, Giamatti died 8 days later. His replacement, Fay Vincent, had the complete opposite opinion on Rose's Hall of Fame eligibility, and in 1990, the Hall of Fame scheduled a vote to make a new rule that made banned players ineligible for the Hall of Fame. But Pete Rose had bigger problems, because at the time, he was in prison. The IRS found that Pete Rose didn't pay taxes for income he made from autographs and memorabilia, and once, after winning $47,000 on a horse racing bet, had his friend Tommy Giosa claim the bet so Rose didn't have to pay taxes on it. Rose was sentenced to 5 months in prison. Giosa was sentenced to 5 years for that, as well as drug trafficking, which Giosa later said Pete Rose was involved in, claiming he picked up cash from his home and used it to buy drugs in Florida. He says that Pete Rose was eager to enter the drug dealing business while still managing the Reds. Another man connected to Rose also told MLB Rose had mentioned to him the possibility of selling drugs to make money while managing. However, police never found any evidence to back these claims up. Giosa also says Pete Rose taught him how to fake his autograph and sign thousands of pieces of memorabilia, which were later sold. He says he would regularly place bets for Rose on baseball and made a 10% cut of all of Pete's losses. And perhaps his most damning claim is that Pete Rose corked his bat in order to break the hit record. And he is not the only person to make this claim. In 2010, several of Pete Rose's game-used bats were x-rayed and showed to be filled with cork. A groundskeeper who worked for the Expos says the visiting clubhouse manager was the one who corked them, and this clubhouse manager recently filmed a video saying that he did cork Pete Rose's bats and even showed everyone how he did it. It seems pretty clear that Pete Rose corked his bats, but seems likely this was only done during the final few seasons of his career. But Pete Rose still denies ever doing it. Despite being banned, Pete Rose is still often celebrated by baseball. He is not allowed in the Hall of Fame, but if you go to Cooperstown, there are over 300 Pete Rose items on display. He was selected for the league's All-Century team, he's in the Reds Hall of Fame, his number is retired in Cincinnati, and he even became a Fox Sports baseball analyst in 2015. But in 2017, Pete Rose was accused of a relationship with an underage girl in the 70s. He maintains the relationship began when the woman was of age, but when documents of the case were released, he was quickly fired by Fox, and the plans for him to be honored by the Phillies were canceled. Despite all of this controversy, it seems like most fans still believe he should be in the Hall of Fame, and to this day, he is still trying to get in. He has applied for reinstatement with every MLB commissioner since his ban and has been denied every single time. So at this point, his chances are slim. But this seems to only add to his legend. Today, he can sell over $10,000 worth of merchandise in one appearance. He has been invited to promote casinos for years, solely because of his reputation as a gambler. He has his own sports betting podcast, and his daily betting picks are featured on a gambling website for $89 a month. As a player, Pete Rose was a fan favorite for his hustle. Since retirement, he stayed relevant in large part just for being banned, and no matter how hard they try to keep him out, his performance on the field has solidified Pete Rose as a baseball icon.